Welcome to the State of Cyber War, a production of the Science, Secure and Mind series of podcasts. Join us as we discuss international cybersecurity policy, information warfare, cyber defense, and how they affect the digital security of the world around us. Hey everybody, welcome back to part 2 of our mini-series on subsea cable communications and shenanigans surrounding underwater fiber optics, whether it's sabotage, interception, or sharks gnawing on them. We left off when we were talking about Houthis dropping cargo ships on undersea cables and some of the military implications of what the motivations, what the capabilities are, either of interception or sabotage. Hugo, some thoughts?
So here, just dragging off directly from your previous point on the last video, would it be an act of war if, for example, a ship which was destroyed fell and destroyed the whole subsea network and so on? My point here would be it's not an attack of war, and like an act of war itself, but the act of war would be actually just damaging the ship, right? Rather than destroying the sea, it would be like the previous act itself. But obviously, now you're going to more dilemma on what each act or each part thinks. But for me, at least, the fact that you just fired something at the ship at first sight, that is the act of war. Then the rest is just consequences after that.
So, what I was clickety-clacketing while you were talking was me Googling, when was the last time anybody actually declared war?
I think that was Russia-Ukraine.
No, an actual declaration of war, where the ambassador formally goes over to the enemy government and hands them over a piece of paper that we are now at war. And I think that was like in the final days of World War II, when some of the smaller South American countries, like Uruguay and so, declared war on Germany, Costa Rica. This is an interesting question, because what is war? We've got whole papers written on this. Is it an act of war? Is it considered an act of war if you are doing something that is a overtly hostile act against an enemy, or perceived an opposing nation, or somebody who supports them, like a civilian cargo ship in the case of the Houthis, and you then unintentionally cause knock-on damage? What does that mean? That's a huge semantic, but I think very important question. And Russia invaded Ukraine, but nobody ever declared war.
For me, obviously the act of declaring war, I think it's more relegated to second place. Because now with all the information and tactics, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, before they invaded Ukraine, there was already a lot of images of Russian troop movement in the border and so on. So obviously you could expect war, an invasion, but obviously there was no formal declaration, as you were mentioning. But once again, I think it also depends on how willing is the country, the actors, to actually fight if something goes on, something goes wrong. So, for example, I don't know, if Spain attacks, reveals information how Portugal is tapping to Spanish communication and presidential communication and so on, would Spain be willing to actually go to war with Portugal? I think that's more the defining factor on, is it an act of war rather than the actual act itself.
And I was actually wrong, because I was just on Wikipedia on the side of you while you were talking. Apparently there have been several formal declarations of war since 1945, including the I didn't know this, but Azerbaijan declaring the existence of a state of war with Armenia in 2020, Djibouti declaring the same against Eritrea in 2010, and a whole list of others, but none of these, I think, involving anybody running subsea cables. So probably less relevant, but worth a look. That was actually really interesting. I just learned something. So thanks for bringing that up. And this is, and I think this is really interesting, because this is a topic that we touched on also in our preparation discussion. I don't want to keep beating up on the Russians, except I do. We've seen in the past couple of weeks, months, a dramatic escalation in what I would personally consider overtly hostile acts by the Russians against not only Ukraine or, others that they've been in conflict with, Georgia, etc., but either on the territory of or against, let's say, quote unquote, Western nations, right? Sabotage of a German munitions plant. We've seen a disruption of European railroad train control systems in April. We've disruption of GPS over the Baltic earlier this year. And things like assassination of Alexander Litvinenko and other at least assassination attempts in the UK and other countries. So, given, correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't think we know who did Nord Stream 2.
I don't think there is suspicion by everyone, but there's no actual correct answer because no one declared themselves as the perpetrator itself.
It would make sense. It would make sense if it were the Ukrainians, for obvious reasons, cutting Europeans off from Russian gas. Maybe a false flag, maybe an accident, who knows? But when we are talking about attacks on undersea cables, right? Like not espionage, not physically tapping into a cable, but actually like cutting a cable with the objective of causing damage to your enemies, or I'll call them enemies, sorry. Their commerce, their stability, their communications, their C4 command control communications computers in a military sense. It's hard to prove, right? It's comparatively easy to do, even if you're dropping a shipwreck on top. Yeah, unleashing the hungry sharks. And it gets into this weird kind of like some geopolitically diplomatic nebulous area where we've seen a ton of hostile activity by not only Russians, right? In Europe, for example, over the last years, but nobody wants to go to war.
I think that would be, I'm still stand strong by my point earlier. It depends on how willing a country is to go to war and actually engage in fighting. Because in the end, most acts can be seen as an act of war if you want to go to war, to be honest.
Yeah.
If you want to fight someone, you find any excuse to actually do it.
That's a good point.
And the excuse will be there. But obviously, if you don't want to, you'll start putting your red line further and further away until there's no other option but to go to war. But obviously, that moving of the red line of your decision, allowing another country to sabotage, tap into your information, tap into your systems, if you're allowing them to do without any repercussions, it's because either you don't want to go to war or because you're doing the same. And obviously, you don't want to attack someone within a month or a year. You're going to find out you're doing the same, and then they're going to attack you back. So it just might be, we're both doing it, let's respect each other. I figured you're doing it before, so stop now, at least for a while. Let's go on with our usual routine.
And I was grimacing just then when you said red line, because that's a really, really good illustrative example of that, which proves your point, which was Barack Obama's, quote unquote, red line about use of chemical weapons in Syria, right? And the Syrians, possibly with the aid of their Iranian and maybe Russian allies, gleefully blew past that red line, and nobody really did anything about it. At least not that we know about. And with regards to subsea cables, also, I think one thing important to consider, we talked about who the stakeholders, who the involved parties are in our last video. Almost all of the countries that are more vulnerable and susceptible to sabotage of undersea cables are going to be more or less liberal democracies, the West in quotes. Yeah?
Yep.
Western countries vote, and voters don't like wars. So I think, to your point, if it's something, it's a piece of infrastructure, it's far away, it's under the water, it's somehow abstract, and even if it's an overly hostile act and somebody cuts a cable, your average voter in France or the UK or the US or Germany is, I don't know, they're going to be less likely to see that as an open aggression, even if deep down they know it is, than if somebody, let's say, they blow up a train station. Have bombs.
I really agree. Also, I think this taps into the perception on it's far away, it's close, it's at home. For example, there's a big issue currently, I'm going to mention once again, the war in Ukraine. But people are like, oh, there's a war, but it's far away. Although it's the first war in Europe,
sight, out of mind. Yeah,
exactly. It's like it's outside my sphere. It's outside my reach. But obviously, it's not, because there's so many different ways to attack. But nowadays as well, you just can send a missile and travels hundreds of kilometers and lands somewhere near you. But obviously, that idea of it's far away, what you were just saying, will put voters against actually going to war, or even just participating in war. So we've seen, for example, in Germany, people going to rallies and so on against war, against even giving supplies and ammunition and so on to Ukraine, because just people don't really see themselves that involved nowadays. But I think that also taps, which you might have a bit more information to, for example, what kind of information treaties they are, because obviously subsea cables, in the end, they join countries, they join regions. Yeah. So obviously there's a lot of parties involved. How can you ensure there's somewhat a stability and an organization around it?
And this is really, I mean, I'm glad we keep mentioning Ukraine because, obviously the other massive hotbeds in the world right now between major powers or nuclear armed powers, at least one involved, are China, Taiwan, and India, China, and India, Pakistan. India, cut it out. Apologies to our Indian viewers, both of them. And I think the situation is not nearly as prevalent and as obvious as with especially Europe and Russia. And it is actually really interesting what you mentioned about the anti-war movement. Obviously, I have my sympathies, right? I'm very transparent about that. And there are questions about, how much propaganda, disinformation, financing is behind this. But if I were Russia, right, and we have basically, I'm trying to invade and take over a sovereign country, and war is being fought on the terrain of Ukraine, but the Europeans and the Americans are delivering tons of arms, and I want to hurt them. I can't bomb their cities, but sabotaging cables is a pretty interesting option to hurt, to some degree, some of their major actors, that these people who are going to protest and who vote, they may not see that, obviously, as just because of that psychological distance.
I mean, I'm just going to mention something very quickly. For example, I don't know if you remember, probably you do. A few years ago, when the Evergreen, the huge, massive cargo ship, blocked the Suez Canal, how big of a deal it was at a global level. Well, now with sabotaging cable, subsea communications, and so on, might be even bigger for specific countries and even regions.
Yeah.
So just the impact that it can have, and the fact that it can be done secretly, or at least more discreetly, it's massive. And how to prepare, once again, my point was how to prepare, how to try to avoid it. Just have to try different ways, different methods. But obviously, if Russia wants to sabotage Europe, that would be one of the best ways.
There's a couple of years ago, and I wasn't able to find an article on this, but I'll look for it again and link it. There were a couple of cables around, I think it was off the Southwest African coast. These cables that go around the continent that were cut. And I don't remember what the reason was, or if they ever found one, but there was a lot of impact, because there was a serious degradation in quality of service to countries like Namibia, South Africa, etc. So it's a very good point. And I'm glad you mentioned the treaties, because this is a good segue into that, because what we haven't got into yet is what are the international legal structures that underpin all this. Now, given this whole conversation about declarations of war, there's a lot of legalities which may seem silly and abstract. If you're blowing stuff up, why do you care if you've declared war? But there's still an international framework about what you aren't allowed to do. The Geneva Conventions, for example, the Hague Convention, etc. And again, I've mentioned the statement from the UK Defense Chief of Staff in our last episode, warning about Russian impact on subsea cables. And this person, and I'll look for a link for this, did mention that an intentional attack on a country's subsea communications infrastructure would be or should be considered an act of war. Yeah. Now, legally, damaging undersea communications infrastructure in international law goes all the way back to, I believe it's 1884. So there's a whole bunch of conventions which eventually were wrapped into what we now call UN CLOS, CLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the thing that famously the Chinese rejected as a basis for arbitration about their expansion in the South China Sea, the 9-7 however many dotted lines, the silly map extension they have. No apologies to our Chinese viewers. And there is a ton of 1884 was the International Convention for the Protection of Submarine Telegraph Cables, or the Paris Convention. So there's nothing in any of these about interception, about wiretapping. We talked last episode about intercepting. I mean, tapping fiber optic cables is kind of a dark art for me. And, if we get into topics like, quantum encryption, where, as far as I understand it, interception will alter the quantum state of... Somebody's going to crucify me in the comments about being an idiot about this, because I really don't get how this works. But my understanding of the whole point of quantum is that if you touch a piece of information, that alters the piece of information and thus destroys the integrity of that. So I don't know what impact that has. But legally, there's nothing in there about wiretapping. There is, however, about, dredging these with anchors or dropping cargo ships on them.
But can I jump in? It might be one of the issues that there's nothing about wiretapping, like espionage within them, because maybe back then there wasn't the technology. That might be one of the biggest issues. The fact that before, let's say like 100 years before, you couldn't actually go down to the sea, be there a few days, just tapping, creating a whole system to actually tap the wire and so on, was not an option. But nowadays it is.
But
maybe the
our modern international treaties have nothing in there either, that I can find at least. I am not an international fiber optic cable lawyer, right? So correct me if I'm wrong. But I wonder whether this isn't one of these dirty little, post Edward Snowden, we know somebody's doing it, but we don't talk about it things.
Might be. And I think it might be just like allowing the loophole there. But from my knowledge of lawyers, if it's not there, it's not there. They tend to be very specific on the language they use for very different things. So obviously, if it's not mentioned, it's because either no one wants it there, or because everybody knows that other people are doing it, so they just don't want to mention it in order to avoid going to war.
Well, plus, I mean, again, by a wide distance, what's the most capable country in terms of doing that interception? It's the U.S., right?
It's the U.S.
And even if they were obviously intercepting underwater traffic and somebody caught them and somebody accused them, what are you going to do about it? No, it's bitter, but realistically, better to focus on, Chinese cargo ships dragging anchors across undersea cables and having an international legal framework that addresses, I think, damage that you have a chance of actually resolving somehow, right? Or if it's a hostile act, let's say if it's the Russians or the Houthis dropping. Sorry, I found that, I know it's not funny, but I am a child, and I had to laugh when I saw that it was completely dumb shit luck that they dropped a cargo ship on it by accident. If it's a hostile act, an intentional hostile act, if you have a legal framework that can quantify what this means for certain other geopolitical outcomes, like are we going to go blow things up because they're doing this? I think that's much more. I assume that the logic behind not including the wiretapping stuff in there is that it's much more important to have a clear set of rules and expectations about when somebody does something much more likely to be able to spot, like somebody damages a cable.
I mean, I think here also goes not back, but let's say it relates to, for example, cyber espionage. So it's happening, but how can you actually prove it? It takes time and effort. So, for example, you can say, I don't know, let's say the U.S. damaged or tapped some subsea cable in the Atlantic, wherever. They might just say, hey, we're just doing military maneuvers, or we were just passing through. You don't really have any more proof rather than, I know you did it, but you're saying publicly you did it. So you're like in a stalemate.
Well, I mean, we had this with the Snowden revelations. And I mean, over the years since Snowden, think of him what you will, the the U.S. government has, even though I'm convinced they're still wiretapping everybody left and right. And yes, they're right. Everybody else is doing it too, but they have become a much more responsible citizen in terms of international cyber cooperation, right? So I think this goes back to our argument, to our conversation about, who benefits and who the stakeholders are, and your point about who is capable of doing what and who relies on what, right? And it's not in the interests of the Americans or the Western world to damage cables, right? Yeah. They're much more reliant on it than Russia, China, and Iran particularly.
And also here, it's a bit on what are you gonna do in the end? Just like, are you gonna attack the US? Are you like gonna attack, let's say, like any NATO country? Or are you gonna attack China? Are you gonna attack Russia? Or are you just gonna like suck it up and be like, hey, don't do it next time, and just try to like avoid it next time?
Blame it on
There's not much. There's not much you can actually do rather than try to increase your own defenses to try to avoid it.
We blame it on Luxembourg because they've been getting away with it for far too long. And that, I think, leads us to our final point, which is alternatives, workarounds. So given the fact that undersea communication is vital, it's a key part of international infrastructure, it has been, I'm not going to say attacked, but it has been damaged, quite plausibly intentionally. It is a very legitimate and tempting target if you can hit it. And there is the potential for interception, as has been the case since World War I. So what are we doing about it? So what alternatives are there?
The first and obviously clearest alternative, Starlink, right now. I mean, for the first one that comes to my mind, obviously you might like or dislike Elon Musk, but Starlink seems to be actually working, seems to be an alternative that's even, as time goes by, seems more of a plausible and larger alternative. Satellite.
Generally, satellite communications. I mean, Starlink is obviously the most prevalent example in the last couple of years.
Exactly, and how you can just switch it around. Obviously, it can still be hacked, can still be infiltrated, sabotaged, and so on. That's not the same as just dropping a ship on top of a subsea cable rather than having to actually launch a missile in order to reach the satellite.
Well, if we get hungry sharks in space, we have a problem. This is actually the security of satellite communications is actually an interesting one. Now, there is a European Union project underway whose name escapes me to secure satellite comms, and I assume the Americans have been doing a huge amount of work on this as well. In fact, one of our fellow Cyan members, Ali Oscar Aaron Pravala, wrote a paper, and I'll link to his blog post on this, about his work on encryption for secure satellite comms. And this is for civilian comms, not just military comms. Obviously there's terrestrial cables for if you have contiguous land borders, like, for example, the Russians have, most of the European Union. But obviously, internationally, intercontinentally, satellite comms are an option. Now,
my biggest issue here is there's still infrastructure that's reachable and can be damaged. I mean, earlier before, I read up on an article in Al Jazeera how Ukraine fired at a Russian base, which had huge amounts of satellites, and was just thought that base was the one controlling Russian satellites, troop movements, and so on. So obviously satellites is a great option, but in the end, there's still terrestrial, let's say, infrastructure that can be damaged. So nothing's perfect, everything can be damaged, but is that an alternative? How reliable is it if you can just throw a missile at the straight base, which gets the data?
Well, the question about Starlink, is Starlink actually real? I actually don't know this. I have to look at this. Is Starlink actually? And I'll look at this after this chat, and put it in the comments. Is Starlink dependent on some kind of a central, communications hub? Your traditional massive and satellite antenna that somebody can blow up? I don't know. Or is it just the Starlink terminals?
I don't know. I'd imagine, I think it's a Starlink terminal, but obviously don't take me for granted there. Don't know much. I think that's more of my guess.
Well, there's another major issue, and if we're talking about, let's say we have, let's say, non-nuclear significant military escalation. A couple years ago, I don't know if you remember, but the Chinese did an anti-satellite weapon test, and they blew up a defunct satellite, and everybody got pissed off about this because it scattered huge amounts of debris all over the near Earth orbit. And I forget, there is a name for this. There's a name for this phenomenon that you could get to a point where you have a chain reaction of debris, of space junk that basically prevents any launches, and that you blow up one satellite, it hits 10 other satellites with debris, and each of those blows up and hits 20 satellites, and all of a sudden you're surrounded by this cloud of like super fast moving crap. All of a sudden satellites become a very, very vulnerable proposition. Now, this is kind of a doomsday scenario because it hurts everybody, but it is something to keep in mind.
Obviously, I'm going to find that out. Once again, I go back to my point. Obviously, it's harder to actually attack and damage a satellite. But once again, you just mentioned it, space, there's no gravity. So one piece of debris is going to be there flying until something pushes it away. So obviously, also, if it's at a massive speed going, it's going to be constant at that speed until it reaches something that stops it. So that would be more like physics, which I'm not going to get into, don't know much about it. But obviously, it can create some of what you just mentioned, doomsday scenario, which is benefits no one, but it can actually benefit someone if you just want to completely destroy and annihilate an enemy, destroy all of its communications, satellite imagery, like navigation systems and so on. Might be a way to go, but obviously no one benefits. But obviously in the total war scenario, everything is valid and everything will be used.
Yeah, so I mean, my immediate instinctive approach would have been satellite comms is more vulnerable to interception. But again, we mentioned quantum crypto, potentially post-quantum cryptography in regards to foiling interception of subsea cable traffic. This is obviously also a topic for satellite comms. Another one is a consideration is bandwidth, latency. Now, a fiber optic cable is always going to be faster than a wireless link, just hands down. So that is something to consider, especially given the data volumes that are flowing over subsea cables, which I don't have at hand right now.
But here I would mention once again, Google is the one that's invested a lot in, for example, fiber optic cables, just because of the amount of information they need to move one way and another. But once again, there is this kind of physical aspect that can be damaged. And for my issue is, within the whole issue, the whole like subsea satellites, is they can damage. There's something you can probably damage to make it stop, like to either destroy it, disrupt it, or just sabotage it. So my workaround would be finding something that doesn't have much of a physical contact. So for example, if there's a satellite or some way of having nothing but the satellite itself would be the best solution, at least for me, because it would avoid and reduce that risk a lot.
Well, there's also a couple of other crazy ideas. I think Google was talking about things like aerostatic blimps, where you have robot airships that basically hold position. I think there's a bunch of these running around somewhere. I have to find this, which themselves are repeaters. Obviously this can be shot down, but it's a little. And I found, by the way, the phenomenon. It's called a Kessler syndrome. Link to this in Wikipedia. It's basically the moment the density of space junk becomes so large that it starts to feed on itself and kill everything in orbit. So there's a bunch of options for wireless communications, obviously. But besides that, I think we're still going to be relying on a mixture of convention, international law, and I'd say the reluctance of hostile actors to really go all out in terms of sabotaging undersea communications. With that, we're running out of time. Thanks again for a great conversation. This has been a really, really wide, meandering one because I think it's a topic that neither of us really knew much about before we went into this.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot. And thanks very much. Don't forget to visit our website, cybersecurityadvisors.network. We've got a bunch of other really cool conversations from a bunch of, half-assed semi-experts like ourselves on various military, geopolitical, and cybersecurity topics. Hugo, see you on the next one.
Well, thank you for having me. See you next time.
Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.